the first scene of the Pokemon anime, Ash Ketchum, he's watching that battle between the Nidorino and the Gengar that we see in the intro of the video game. And it's kind of cool, but something that I find interesting about that scene is how, in that moment, Ash kinda represents us, as in, like, the audience. Because as kids, when we're first getting into Pokemon and whatnot, one of the biggest things, like one of the most appealing factors of it, is the whole fantasy of it. The idea of going on a Pokemon journey and battling in the league and becoming the strongest, it's a strong hook. And especially for a kid, that usually is enough to get them very invested in this world, in the external media, and the video games and the card games, because they want to be a Pokemon trainer. Just like how Ash wanted to be a Pokemon trainer in the beginning of the show. But unlike the show, we can't exactly go on a Pokemon journey in real life and fulfill that 100%. We've gotten closer. That's exactly why the external media exists. Part of the appeal is exactly getting you closer to that idea. The video games are a Pokemon journey in of themselves, and the card game allows you to collect the Pokemon and battle them physically. And Pokemon Go especially basically exploded because of that appeal. It's the closest we've gotten to going around and just catching Pokemon as if they were around in the real world, just out there. But none of them quite fulfill the fantasy in a way that would leave kid me 100% satisfied. A part of me always felt that I've never quite gotten to that point where I can say I am a Pokemon trainer, right? We're all just people who like Pokemon. And I mean, that's fine, the games are fun, the anime is fun, I enjoy this franchise as a whole. But I feel like they kind of fail to live up to the whole fantasy by themselves. As a single player experience, the games are safe. Everyone's gonna be the champion by the end of it. Everyone's gonna catch the box art legendary, so it truly means like most legendaries aren't really legendary because everyone can get them. Pretty much everyone who's beaten the game has at least one legendary. So the idea of like standing out as a Pokemon trainer IRL couldn't exactly be replicated just by that, especially because, yeah, Pokemon is a fictional franchise. Pokemon aren't real. You can't really be a Pokemon trainer, right? Well, forever it seemed truly impossible to achieve that. And again, it makes sense. These are video games and these are imaginary creatures, they're not real. You can't really go out there and become a Pokemon trainer. You're crazy if you're actually trying to do that. But for the longest time, right under my nose, there was something that would get astonishingly close to that. VGC, so it stands for Video Game Championships, is the official format for Pokemon competitive play, as in how most pro players compete in Pokemon video game tournaments officially. And they're kind of a big deal. These tournaments aren't just something you do online, they're officially sanctioned by the Pokemon Company, and they have regionals all around the world. It's a whole thing, it's a whole scene. And of course, as a fan, I've always been aware of competitive Pokemon. It's always been around, people always talk about it, but it's always had this huge barrier to entry, or at least it seemed like it, and I was never fully able to get into it up until very recently. You see, to actually have a chance to compete in competitive Pokemon, you have to understand the underlying mechanics that the game usually doesn't really explain very well, if at all. So you got stuff like EVs and IVs and natures and the metagame and all that you basically have to understand if you want to play at least decently. And to some, that may even seem a little bit disingenuous to Pokemon's overall message. You know, the whole story and moral dilemma, or whatever the anime usually brings up, or even the game sometimes, is like how you should win alongside your Pokemon. They're your partners, and you gotta pick your favorites and go with them and just, do your best, never give up, and you always succeed. But working with mechanics such as IVs and EVs and natures and all that usually requires you to do a bit of, what would be the right word for that? Eugenics. So basically, especially back in the day, before these mechanics got more streamlined, for you to have the ideal Pokemon that you're able to use in competitive play, you'd have to breed them up until you got the one with the right nature, the right IVs, then you gotta train them in a very specific way so they got the right stats so you can actually bring them to battle. And also because of the metagame and because certain Pokemon are naturally gonna be stronger than others, for you to make a competitively viable team, you basically have to use at least a few of the stronger Pokemon, which means Despite that message that was even echoed in one of the very first games, in Generation 2, one of the Elite Four members, Karen, she says this line that has become quite infamous when it comes to this kind of discussion. Strong Pokemon, weak Pokemon. That is only the selfish perception of people. Truly skilled trainers should try to win with their favorites. And I feel like that whole perception, like, it's fair, but when it comes to competitive Pokemon, it's kinda missing the point. Yeah, about the barrier to entry thing, it still kinda sucks, but we're getting better. As I mentioned, they are slowly introducing more mechanics that make it easier for anyone to just train their Pokemon quickly and easily so they're usable in competitive battling. We're in a point where you can basically take any Pokemon, even the ones that you've used in the story, and as long as they are viable as a species, you can train them up without having to breed for a different one. There are a few cases here and there where that's not really the case, but for the most part, you can use pretty much any Pokemon just fine as long as you train them up properly. It's still sort of questionable thematically, but like, come on, you gotta ignore some of the stuff so you can actually enjoy the game. But as far as being difficult to get into, there are tons of resources out there that explain all the mechanics and all the necessary knowledge very well, to the point where in like about a week or so of active playing, you're pretty much gonna be on the same page as everybody else and you're gonna be able to play just fine. I recommend VGC Guide, which is this really cool, complete website. And there are also tons of YouTube content creators. Wolfie VGC is a very famous one, because he's one of the best players out there. Been a world champion before, he's really good, and he has a few videos teaching you how to get into the game. And it's definitely worth a watch. But yeah, getting into it, something I find very interesting is that in this sort of like period of just about a week, if so, of playing, you're gonna be up to date with everyone else, and also you're gonna be playing decently well. Because of the nature of Pokemon as a turn-based game, it's really more about understanding the game than being technically good at, you know, pressing buttons good and stuff. You don't need to be absolutely perfect to just compete well, to do some battles and do your best. As long as you have a decently built team and understand how the mechanics work, which you should, considering you probably, if you own the games and you're trying to play competitively, you probably already finished the story, you can compete pretty decently. The skill ceiling is definitely very high, and players on the highest technical level can get really specific about their strategies, and that's really cool. But as far as the skill floor goes, I'd argue it's actually pretty low. As long as you've gone through the threshold of getting into it, pretty much anyone has a chance to play decently well. Pokemon is a volatile enough game where that's possible. Yeah, as far as using your favorite Pokemon over using what's relevant in the meta, yeah, some sacrifice like that is natural, but it's not the end of the world. There's honestly a ton of team flexibility in competitive Pokemon. Because of how metagames naturally work and build off of each other. Okay, there's gonna be the main Pokemon you need to be worried about and you need to counterplay well, but you can still do some crazy creative team ideas. To be fair, you've never really been able to use all your favorites, even in single player, because a Pokemon team is always limited by 6 Pokemon slots. And like, are you seriously gonna tell me you have specifically 6 Pokemon that you always like to use? In competitive play in tournaments, you're always gonna be building different teams to adapt to the current metagame and stuff, so there's tons of chances to make some crazy teams with your favorite Pokemon. And you can switch around. You can use many different favorites. You can use many different cool Pokemon that you maybe never didn't like before. But as you play with them and understand how they work, suddenly you might enjoy them a little bit more. Like, let's be real, not even the anime and all the external media pretends that's true. There's always been a distinction between what's supposed to be a strong Pokemon and a weak Pokemon in theory. Of course, yeah, the anime is gonna be more flexible with that. Ash's Pikachu is an absolute monster. But for the most part, there's still gonna be characters who are gonna, for better or worse, see a legendary Pokemon and be like, holy crap, this one's super strong. And the same stands for competitive play. It's only natural. While we can never truly get to the extremes we see in the anime, with the 2 insanely busted Pikachus that have been part of the main cast by this point, people can do miracles in competitive Pokemon. This is a very overdone story, and everyone's talked about it, but in a certain World Championships, a guy won using a freaking Pachirisu. To be fair, it was a very well-built team that used Pachirisu in a very smart and technical way, but that's part of the fun. If you really want to use a certain Pokemon, you might just find a niche for it that maybe nobody else has seen. As long as you make it work, it works, and it's cool, and it's even more exciting to see them there. In actuality, lots of pros make wacky off-meta teams that end up doing pretty well. Just look at Wolfie, who I mentioned before. He makes tons of really out there, unpredictable teams that are usually really good because nobody's expecting them. Nobody knows how to deal with them properly, so they end up standing out because of that. And that's even ignoring Smelgon tiers. Because, okay, so I've been talking about VGC in this video because it's the format I personally play, and I also like it because it has those official tournaments and all that experience around it. But if you enjoy singles 1v1 battles, and you just want to play online on like Pokemon Showdown or whatever, you can also play Smelgon, which is basically a different game. It's a format that's pretty much just fan-regulated, and they use different tiers to categorize each Pokemon species, so you always have like a fair matchup going into it. So have tiers of, okay, so this Pokemon is banned on this lower tier, but it's allowed on this higher tier. So every Pokemon is going to be relevant in at least like one of the many categories they have in that. It's a whole different thing. VGC doesn't have that. VGC just allows you to use everything according to each format that they're going with each time, which usually allows for most of the Pokédex at least. But either way, VGC ends up being pretty self-regulating a lot of the time because of this whole cycle. You have some Pokemon that are prevalent in the metagame currently, and then you're gonna have someone who's gonna figure out something completely different that doesn't seem useful at first, but because they're good against whatever is good in the meta, or people aren't exactly prepared to deal with this unorthodox Pokemon, this unorthodox team, suddenly people are gonna be losing to you, and then your team's gonna get popular, and that becomes meta, and that's usually how the cycle works. That's usually how the game goes. So there's always room to experiment and try new stuff. Like, really, this idea that VGC players are all heartless technical players who spend all day doing calculations, it's wrong! It's absolutely wrong! We bring plushies of our favorite Pokebuddies to official tournaments. Even if they can't battle, we can still bring them along, no one's left behind. We're all freaking goofballs, basically. We're all trying to do different stuff and have fun and enjoy the game. And yeah, I really have been enjoying the game. Getting into VGC has been a great experience for me. I'm a fairly new player. I started back in late 2022, more or less. Story goes that I had just finished Scarlet and Violet and actually really enjoyed it. I've talked about it in a few videos before. It's a fun game. And in addition to just wanting to keep playing it after I finished it, this was around the time Ash Ketchum from the anime won like the whole World Championship they had going over in the anime, and now he's not even the protagonist anymore. And also there's a cutscene in Scarlet and Violet where you battle your rival Nemona for the last time in the story, and it has this sort of energy where you're both like circling each other, and like she's talking about how it's gonna be a battle of wills and whatnot, and it's a small little cutscene. It's just one final battle, but I'll be honest, that excitement kind of infected me a little bit. After doing that final battle and watching that cutscene and whatnot, it got me really interested and excited to do battles IRL, to battle with other people that actually exist and see how strong it can actually be and experience all of that for myself, instead of just role-playing it in a video game. But yeah, after finishing the game and after deciding that I would play competitive, I slowly started watching content creators, and as I went, I gradually started understanding the current game at the time and how it was going. And that's something really great about VGC. The meta is always growing and changing. It feels like an evolving game. So, 1. You don't have to know everything about the game's past to just get in. You just need to know what's good now, what people are using and how to counter it. And the second benefit is that there's always something new to see. It makes you feel like you're part of something. Because if you're keeping up with the content creators and what they're talking about, there are even like podcasts and people discussing about whatever is going on the internet. It's an oddly laid back, but at the same time, sort of productive activity. I mean, how productive can playing a competitive video game be, am I right? but it feels a little bit more productive because you're understanding something that you put a lot of effort into, and if you want to compete, you know, that's a life goal right there. You can go far with this. Depends on how much you want out of it. But it's really chill too on some mornings when I don't know what to listen to on my phone. I can just bring out a VGC podcast and just listen to what is going on in the game right now, what people are using, what happened in the last few tournaments and all that. It always feels like there's something going on. This is a kind of excitement I haven't felt about the series since I was a kid. You know, when you're first getting into Pokemon as a kid, maybe if you even haven't been able to complete a game yet, there's this whole excitement around, you know, all the cool, strong, legendary Pokemon and all the new things the anime is doing and whatnot for the next game that's coming out. But as you grow older, you usually start to get desensitized to these things. Beating a game is literally just beating a game. It only really takes time. And games take a while to come out, so it's not like you're always going to be excited for the next thing. When you're a kid and you see Zekrom in the new Pokemon movie, it's like, holy crap, that one is really strong, I've heard about it. But once you get older and realize everyone who owns Pokemon White has Zekrom, it loses its luster. But in VGC, you can kind of get this sort of feeling back. You get to make comments like, oh, that Pokemon is really strong and it's doing numbers in X, Y, and Z situations. And finding out what's the new thing of the week, pretty much. For better or worse, the game is always evolving, but not in a way that's kind of like, I guess, exploitative. Usually games that are always evolving like this nowadays tend to lean more on the live service, gacha, or whatever exploitative side of gaming, and most big competitive esports sorta usually fall around that area. And thankfully, Pokemon isn't one of them, which is a great thing. But it kind of compensates with unnecessary grinding in the single player. Whatever work you would initially do trying to get that one specific drop, now you're just working to train up your Pokemon. Sometimes it can be a little exhausting and a little grindy, and admittedly it can sort of feel like one of those live service grindy online games, even though it really isn't. I guess the good side to all of this is that basically Pokemon is sort of an antithesis to most of those addicting, dopamine-feeling competitive games you usually get nowadays. Because instead of making you pay for stuff and trying to make you addicted to it, it sometimes feels like, due to how complicated some things can be, the game kind of stops you from being too addicted to it, which, depending on how you look at it, might even be a good thing. It's all your dedication. Everyone is more or less on the same level, more or less facing the same difficulties, so even though it's a little bit frustrating, it kind of ends up leveling the playing field a little bit. Version differences aside, which is, you know, a thing, but it's mostly negligible, I'd say. But anyway, going back to the good stuff, because of the apparent huge barrier to entry, and because the players are always discussing between themselves and getting up to whatever's going on in the game currently, there's a sort of, I guess, insularity to it. And a good thing about that is that it comes with a lot of really fun inside jokes. Competitive Pokemon memes are great, and you've probably seen them already out there, because the joke is that they're seemingly incomprehensible. And I get that can make the game seem even more inaccessible, but it's really not that hard to understand if you're playing for, again, like maybe a week or so. As long as you get into the game, which isn't actually that hard to do, it's just about understanding a few things. It's not that big of a process. You'll understand the memes just fine, and there's a cool sort of smug sensation you get when you show the meme to a friend who doesn't get anything about competitive Pokemon and you just look completely puzzled. It's freaking hilarious. But aside from the incomprehensible ones, there are tons of memes and jokes about specific events. Just from a recent regionals that happened, we got this hilarious image of Wolfie hiding when he found out what his opponent's team was. And in the same tournament, he won against a dude that was outed to be sort of transphobic, and he won because of Among Us, so now Among Us is a symbol for trans rights, and that's just funny and cool. Trans rights, let's go. And again, I really like this stuff. It really, again, makes you feel like a part of something bigger. Speaking of, when I finally went to my first regional tournament, it was great. It sort of felt like a con, you know, like a nerdy convention or whatever, but not exactly. The experience isn't exactly the same. It's definitely easier to go up and talk to anyone, which is great, because since everyone's playing the same game here, everyone's sort of on the same page, So sometimes you can just run up to anyone and go, hey, what team you're using or whatever, and just start discussing the game. As long as the person's down to talking, we can just discuss, and it's very easy to form friendships and interact with the community while in there. But it's also, of course, a lot more exhausting than a con because, yeah, this is still a tournament, so you're going to be playing a lot, and there's usually lots of games in succession, so you're going to be out of that, like, completely baked. You're basically guaranteeing a great night of sleep afterwards. It's a lot of pressure, but almost in a good way. Because despite being turn-based, Pokémon is a very tense and exciting game. Clutch wins and multifaceted decision-making compose a lot of what Pokémon is about in practice. Even though the game is turn-based, they imply the in-universe experience of battling and giving commands to your Pokémon and being excited and nervous when stuff happens is translated pretty well into the system. Sometimes you're gonna get these insane clutch wins or something unexpected is gonna happen, it's gonna change your return perspective on the game. So your heart is always gonna be beating at like 1,000,000 an hour, you're always gonna be super nervous and super tense, and of course you gotta be able to relax and focus. You're gonna play better if you relax and focus. But this sort of like tense and exciting dynamic is something that you initially wouldn't expect from a turn-based game. But Pokemon actually really nails it, in my experience. Not to get too deep into game design analysis here, but another really cool thing about Pokemon combat is partially because the series is so long and there's so many creatures and there's so many moves to choose from, and the way they're made and designed and programmed, it means that nowadays most people aren't gonna know every single move in the game, and that's normal, like that's natural. So it ends up being a lot more complex than your simple card games or whatever else that can be turn-based out there, but in a way that's somehow even more accessible than those. Everything is always so tactile. There's stuff like contact moves and status effects on top of the basic typing that we're all familiar with. So every move kind of makes sense in a spatial setting as well. It's not all about the technical terms and the numbers. Even if you might not understand something from a technical sense, you can sometimes just read a move description and just get it. You know where it applies, you know what it is, and you might even think of some ideas of how to mix it up with other moves that you have. Oh, this move does contact, I better not use it against people who use a Pokemon with rough skin that would naturally hurt the Pokemon using the contact move. It's always kind of obvious, but in a really interesting and deep way. It never goes too far away from the simple and logical water beats fire logic that basically the entire battle system is built around. It really inspires being creative. In a way, Pokemon is kind of a game of self-expression. Yeah, by the end of the tournament, I didn't do amazing, but I did fairly well. As I said, there's a low skill floor, so I didn't lose every battle I fought. So with the practice I had before the tournament, I was able to play to a satisfying degree. I was happy with the results, and just in general, I had an amazing time just interacting and having fun with folks. I made friends and everything, like it's great, it's super chill. As I said earlier, the reality is that the VGC community is just a bunch of fun goofballs. Everyone is really passionate about the game, and even if there's the occasional jerk and a suspiciously low amount of female players, like seriously, I mean nothing when I say this. I know esports are drastically more male-dominated in general, but Pokemon is such an inclusive series, and VGC has such a welcoming community, it's honestly kind of frustrating that there isn't more variety in the types of people that play it. Overall, I found the community to just be very fun and enjoyable to be around. It's a warm bunch of people. But yeah, ultimately, VGC is the closest I've ever felt to actually being a real Pokemon trainer. Heck, they even call the players trainers in the official tournaments. Out of game and in-game team building feels like I'm actually training my own Pokemon team for a competition, because I literally am. And traveling to different tournaments, while it doesn't translate one-to-one, is kind of a mini Pokemon journey you get to take. I mean, if you're good enough and have enough money, you can even travel abroad for tournaments. The World Championships is gonna be in freaking Hawaii this year. I'd say there's definitely a bit of friction between the idea of VGC as just a general esport and VGC as specifically a way to realize the fantasy of competing in Pokemon battles IRL. And I think every player is going to have a bit of a different point of view of that, but really the truth lies somewhere in between. VGC is both of these things. It's both a way to compete in a really cool, really complex and interesting esport, but also a way to just battle Pokemon, just like you maybe did as a kid, you know, with your friends. Oh, let's link cable or GBAs in battle, or IR or D assets in battle, and it felt exciting and it felt tense. This is just taken to its natural extreme. People are taking that and going to tournaments and creating a Pokemon League. And it basically feels like that phase of excitement around Pokemon that you had as a kid never stopped for people who play VGC. It's still going on, it's still right there. But that friction is probably why there's still issues, such as how in-game team building can be a drag, because it's simultaneously trying to, reward players for actually playing the game and building their teams in-game, which is the whole core of the Pokemon experience as intended. But I still argue this is the closest we've ever had to real Pokemon battles out of the alternatives. TCG, while cool and while the cards are physical and there's still like some stuff like trying to get them IRL and stuff, having to buy them, they're cards. Exactly. You have to buy them. It's not like catching Pokemon. It's not really the same thing. And the playstyle was completely different. It's an adaptation. It's not one-to-one. And while Pokemon Go lets you go outside to actually catch the Pokemon in real life, it's still too simplistic in a gameplay sense. In a lot of ways, when I play Pokemon Go, I don't feel like I'm playing Pokemon. I feel like I'm playing something else with Pokemon in it. It's a fitness game more than a real Pokemon experience in a lot of ways. At the end of the day, the series was from the beginning built around the video games, and it shows. Everything else is just trying to adapt them. So of course the closest experience to a real Pokemon battle is gonna be in the actual games. Really, I just think it's kinda sad that many fans out there who could enjoy VGC simply don't because the game is too intimidating. It's not. At least it doesn't have to be. Just try and give it a shot. Trust me, it's worth it. In general, the VGC community is just way more stable than the main game fandom nowadays. A lot of players can still enjoy the single player. Everyone's still a fan after all, but the conversation isn't always looping around the same discussions of quality and generation wars that are kinda admittedly partially caused by the multiplayer aspect existing. As long as there's still new enjoyable games coming out that we can still battle in. We might even have our issues, but we're still vibing, we're still enjoying it. It's nice to talk about Pokemon and not be surrounded by a flame war once in a while. The more I look back, the more I realize how much I've been missing out on. Even for the stupid game quality discourse, it honestly feels like you're missing out on a perspective if you don't play competitive. You really aren't fully experiencing the games if you ask me, or at least all of their extent and what they can do and what they can be. So here's my invitation. If you haven't played VGC yet, but enjoy the Pokemon games and the experience they're in, please come around to the VGC corner over here. I'm sure you won't be disappointed. And also, if you're already a player, feel free to share your stories and experiences in the comments. Ideally, in a perfect world, I'd love if this comment section down here becomes a hub for our new and old players to express why this game is so fun and why people should give it a shot. That would be very nice and probably very encouraging for people getting in. Anyway, that's all I had to say for today. Thanks so much for watching, and your boy Ash is signing out. See you later.